Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Tonight, we return to the rolling green hills of the Shire, where a quiet evening can hide mysteries buried deep beneath the earth. This is a story of lost maps and ancient secrets, of echoes from a time long past, waiting in the dark. Let your mind drift, your breathing slow, and the weight of the day melt away. Close your eyes and imagine the flickering glow of a candle beside you, the scent of old parchment, the distant hoot of an owl beyond your window. Now, listen closely. Our story begins. Bilbo Baggins sat by the fireplace of Bag End, staring at the crackling flames as they danced within the stone hearth. The warmth of the fire filled the cozy hobbit hole, casting flickering shadows on the wooden beams above. The scent of fresh pipeweed lingered in the air, blending with the sweet aroma of a half-eaten honey cake resting on the table beside him. He had been home for years now, away from the perils of his grand adventure with Thorin Oakenshield and the company of dwarves. Yet, on nights like these, when the world outside was silent and the stars hung like distant lanterns in the sky, his mind would wander back to the days of gold, dragons, and perilous roads. It had been a long time since he had rummaged through the old chest that lay tucked away in the corner of his study. A relic of his travels, filled with trinkets and scrolls he had collected over the years, it remained mostly untouched. Tonight, however, he felt a peculiar urge to open it, as if something deep within was calling out to him. Rising from his chair with a quiet sigh, Bilbo made his way through the dimly lit hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps as he reached the study, a small, book-filled room where dust motes danced in the golden glow of a single candle. The chest sat there, its iron-bound frame aged but sturdy. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing over the worn leather handle before he unlatched the lock and lifted the lid. Inside, an assortment of objects greeted him, an old dagger given to him by Thorin, a small, dented helm belonging to a dwarf from Erebor, various scrolls and maps, and a golden belt buckle that once belonged to a man he had met in Rivendell. As he carefully sifted through them, his hands fell upon a piece of parchment, curled and yellowed with time. Something about it felt different. Unrolling the parchment, Bilbo's eyes widened as he realized what he was holding. It was a map. But not just any map. This was an old dwarven chart, intricately drawn with fine ink, its edges decorated with ancient runes. A faint memory stirred within him. Thorin had once mentioned a map, one that was separate from the one they had used to find Erebor. A personal map, he had called it. A map that was meant to lead to something else, something he never spoke of openly. Bilbo frowned, holding the map closer to the candlelight. It bore no markings of Erebor, no indications of Smaug's lair, but instead depicted a different terrain, one that Bilbo could not immediately recognize. The mountains drawn upon it were unfamiliar, and at the center of the parchment there was a peculiar symbol, an eye, surrounded by jagged lines, as if it were meant to signify something dangerous. Along the edges, dwarven script wove around the map like a frame, etched in Thorin's careful hand. Jangon by Arkanini Jata Kutangon Young Sulla. The words sent a chill down Bilbo's spine. He had never known Thorin to be secretive about such things. What was so important about this map that he felt the need to keep it hidden? And why had he left it behind? Thorin had perished in the Battle of the Five Armies, and with him had gone the many secrets he carried. Was this map meant to lead to treasure? Or something else entirely? Bilbo glanced around the study as if expecting someone to be watching him, though he knew he was alone. The thought unsettled him. He had not felt this kind of unease since his journey through Mirkwood. Shaking his head, he folded the map carefully and placed it inside a leather pouch before tucking it away in one of the many drawers of his desk. Perhaps Gandalf would know more about it. He made a mental note to ask the wizard when next they met, though something in his gut told him that he might not like the answer. The night carried on, but sleep did not come easily for Bilbo. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind unable to shake the image of that strange eye drawn upon the map. The wind howled gently outside, rustling the trees beyond Bag End, and for the first time in many years, Bilbo Baggins felt a whisper of adventure call to him once more. But this time, it did not feel like the warm embrace of discovery. It felt like the cold grasp of something forgotten, waiting to be found. The morning sun crept through the round windows of Bag End, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Birds chirped merrily outside, and the familiar scent of fresh-baked bread from the kitchens of Hobbiton drifted through the air. It was an ordinary morning, peaceful and bright, as it always was in the Shire. But for Frodo Baggins, today felt different. He had always enjoyed mornings at Bag End, the comforting routine of preparing tea, sitting by the garden, and listening to the distant chatter of other hobbits. But today, something nagged at the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he was tidying up Bilbo's study, organizing old books and maps, that he stumbled upon the cause of his unease. The map. It had been tucked away inside a leather pouch within Bilbo's writing desk. He hadn't noticed it the first time he looked through the drawers, but now, as he moved some old scrolls aside, his fingers brushed against the worn leather. The moment he pulled it out, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. Something about it felt important. Frodo had always been fascinated by the stories Bilbo told him of dragons, dwarves, and great battles fought in distant lands. Though he was content with the simple life of a hobbit, a small part of him longed for adventure, for something more than the rolling green hills of the Shire. And now, as he unrolled the map, he wondered if he had just found it. The parchment was old, its edges slightly curled, but the ink was still crisp, as if the map had been well preserved despite the passing years. Frodo studied the lines carefully. It wasn't a map of the Shire, nor of the Lonely Mountain. He had seen Bilbo's old maps of those places before. This was different. The rivers, valleys, and mountains drawn on it didn't match anything he recognized. But then, his eyes fell upon the strange symbol at the center of the map. An eye. It was surrounded by jagged lines, almost like rays of light or cracks in the earth. It made him uneasy. Frodo traced the ink with his finger, feeling a shiver run down his spine. And then, he noticed something else, faint, barely visible markings running along the borders of the parchment. Words. But they were in a script he could not read. Dwarvish. He had seen Bilbo's old dwarven contract from Thorin's company, and though he didn't understand the language, he recognized the style of writing. What did it say? Was it instructions? A warning? His curiosity burned brighter. He needed to know more. A thought struck him, Gandalf. The wizard often visited the Shire, though it had been some time since Frodo had last seen him. If anyone could decipher this, it would be Gandalf. But when would he return? There was no telling. He could be weeks, months away. And Frodo wasn't sure he wanted to wait that long. Maybe someone else could help. He knew Merry and Pippin would jump at the chance to investigate something mysterious. They were always eager for mischief, and this was far more exciting than stealing mushrooms from Farmer Maggot. Sam, on the other hand, might be more cautious, but he was loyal and would follow wherever Frodo led. The thought of sneaking around made Frodo hesitate. Bilbo had obviously kept this map hidden for a reason. If it were just another old relic from his adventure, why would he tuck it away instead of displaying it with the rest of his souvenirs? And then he noticed something strange. As he turned the parchment slightly under the morning light, something shimmered on its surface. He frowned, angling it again. Faint, almost invisible, there were more markings, hidden until the light hit them just right. His breath caught in his throat. Invisible ink? No, not ink. This was something else. Some form of magic. A sudden thrill coursed through him. He needed to see this in full. His mind raced. How could he reveal whatever was hidden? He recalled something Bilbo had once told him about an old dwarven technique for hiding messages. Moonlight. The words would only reveal themselves under the glow of the moon. Frodo sat back in his chair, staring at the map with a mix of excitement and unease. He would have to wait until nightfall. His heart pounded at the thought. Would it lead to treasure? A forgotten ruin? Or something more dangerous? His mind was made up. He would wait. And he would not do it alone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frodo made his way toward the Green Dragon Inn, where he knew he would find Merry and Pippin. The inn was lively, filled with the laughter and chatter of hobbits enjoying their drinks. The scent of roasted meat and fresh ale filled the air as Frodo pushed through the crowd to find his friends seated at their usual corner table. Merry, Pippin, he said, lowering his voice as he took a seat. I need your help with something. Pippin, already halfway through a mug of ale, raised an eyebrow. Help with what? Not another lost sheep, I hope. Merry leaned in, intrigued. You look serious, Frodo. What is it? Frodo hesitated for only a moment before pulling the folded map from his coat and placing it on the table. The two hobbits stared at it, their curiosity immediately piqued. It's a map, Frodo explained, keeping his voice low. An old one. I found it in Bilbo's study. Merry's eyes lit up. Bilbo's map? You mean treasure? I don't know, Frodo admitted. But I think there's something hidden on it. Something we can only see under moonlight. Pippin straightened up, suddenly alert. Magic? Frodo nodded. I need to take it somewhere away from prying eyes. Somewhere quiet. Merry grinned. We know just the place. The three hobbits slipped out of the inn and made their way through the winding paths of Hobbiton. The night air was cool, and the moon had begun to rise, casting a pale glow over the rolling hills. Merry led them to a secluded clearing atop a hill overlooking the Shire. It was quiet here, with no one around to disturb them. Frodo carefully laid the map on a flat rock and took a deep breath. The moon was bright now, its silver light washing over the parchment. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, faint letters began to emerge, glowing softly in the moonlight. Pippin gasped. It's working. Merry leaned closer. "What does it say?" Frodo's heart pounded as the hidden script fully revealed itself. And then, as his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. For this was not a map leading to treasure. This was a warning. And whatever it warned against lay beneath the Shire. Frodo's hands trembled slightly as he traced the glowing runes on the ancient map. The silver inscriptions shimmered under the candlelight, their meaning slowly revealing itself in his mind. The weight of what he had uncovered was beginning to settle in, heavier than he had expected. This was not just a treasure map. It was something older, something buried. Beneath the roots of the land, beneath the bones of the earth, lies the secret of the forgotten king. Disturb not his slumber, lest the darkness wake once more. A chill ran down Frodo's spine. The words did not sound like a clue leading to riches. They sounded like a warning. Merry and Pippin, who had been leaning over his shoulder, exchanged uncertain glances. Pippin's usual excitement was dampened by the ominous words. What does that mean?" he asked, his voice unusually hushed. Frodo exhaled, shaking his head. "It means whatever this map is pointing to, we are not supposed to find it." Merry frowned. "A forgotten king? The bones of the earth? That doesn't sound like any story I've heard about the Shire." Pippin ran a hand through his curls nervously. "Maybe it's a legend we just never paid attention to. There are plenty of old tales, aren't there?" Frodo nodded slowly. The Shire had its fair share of myths, but nothing like this. The land had always been peaceful, untouched by the grand histories of Middle-earth. And yet, this map suggested otherwise. The room suddenly felt smaller, the candlelight flickering as if disturbed by an unseen draft. Frodo swallowed hard and carefully folded the map, tucking it into his coat. "We should talk about this somewhere else." Merry and Pippin didn't argue. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Whatever they had found, it was not meant to be discovered by prying ears. The night was thick with mist when they finally slipped outside. Hobbiton was quiet, the rolling hills bathed in pale moonlight. The distant sounds of a few late-night revelers at the Green Dragon faded as they moved further from Bag End, their steps light against the soft earth. They walked in silence, only stopping when they reached a familiar knoll overlooking the Brandywine River. The same spot they had spent countless evenings, watching the stars and dreaming of adventures. Tonight, however, there was no laughter, only the weight of the unknown pressing upon them. Frodo carefully unfolded the map once more. The glowing runes had faded now, only visible under the moon's touch. He ran his fingers over the parchment, feeling the slight grooves of the ink. Merry leaned closer. "All right. Let's think this through properly. If the map says something is beneath the land, then there must be an entrance somewhere." Frodo nodded. "And it has to be hidden. If it were obvious, someone would have found it by now." Pippin, who had been quiet for longer than usual, suddenly pointed at a faint marking near the bottom of the map. "What about this?" The three of them peered closer. The marking was faint, nearly lost against the aging parchment, but its shape was unmistakable, a door. Merry's eyes lit up. "That looks like an entrance." Frodo studied the faint symbols surrounding the door. They were small, intricate, nearly indecipherable. But as he squinted, he could make out something written beneath the sketch. "One does not open without the whispers of the past." Frodo's stomach tightened. Another riddle. Pippin frowned. What does that mean? Frodo shook his head. I don't know. Merry rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Could be something to do with history. Maybe a name? Or a phrase? Frodo sighed. Whatever it is, we need to find the door first. Then we can figure out how to open it. Merry glanced around. And where exactly do we start looking? Frodo traced his finger along the map, comparing the markings to the familiar landscape of the Shire. The placement of the door seemed to align with the edge of the South Farthing, near the old woods, a place rarely visited except by the most adventurous hobbits. The South Farthing, he murmured. Pippin groaned. I knew you were going to say that. Merry grinned. Oh, come now, Pippin. Think of it as an adventure. Bilbo would have loved this. Pippin muttered something about missing his warm bed, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Frodo folded the map. We'll go tomorrow morning. If there's something buried beneath the Shire, I want to know what and why. Dawn arrived with a golden hue, stretching long fingers of light across the rolling hills. By the time the three hobbits had packed their supplies, lanterns, ropes, and enough food to last a day, most of which Pippin insisted was necessary for second breakfast emergencies, they were ready to set off. The journey to the South Farthing took most of the morning. The usual bustling fields and farms of the Shire gave way to quieter, more untamed lands. The trees here were older, their roots thick and gnarled, stretching deep into the earth. The atmosphere subtly changed as they neared the woods. The songs of birds faded, replaced by a hush that felt almost expectant. Pippin shivered. This place gives me the shivers. Merry, who was leading, paused to examine the map again. The door should be around here somewhere. Frodo nodded, scanning the land ahead. If the entrance had been hidden for so long, it wouldn't be easy to find. It was likely buried, overgrown, or camouflaged by nature itself. They moved cautiously, parting thick vines and pushing aside old branches. Then, after nearly an hour of searching, Merry gasped. Frodo! Over here! Frodo hurried to his side, eyes widening as he followed Merry's gaze. At the base of an ancient oak tree, half hidden by twisting roots and thick moss, lay a stone doorway. It was exactly as it had been drawn on the map. Frodo's breath caught. We found it. Pippin let out a nervous chuckle. Well, that was easier than expected. Merry shot him a look. We haven't even figured out how to open it yet. Frodo stepped closer, brushing his fingers against the rough stone surface. The carvings were old, so old that many had faded with time. But beneath the moss, faint runes still remained. The same inscription from the map was etched here as well. One does not open without the whispers of the past. Frodo exhaled slowly. This was no ordinary door. Something was buried beneath the Shire. And now they were about to wake it. A heavy silence hung over the three hobbits as they stood before the ancient stone doorway. The cool morning air felt thick, pressing down on them like an unseen weight. Frodo reached out, tracing the worn edges of the runes with his fingertips. They were deep, carved long ago by hands that no longer walked the earth. One does not open without the whispers of the past. Frodo's mind turned the phrase over and over. What could it mean? A secret phrase? A name lost to time? He could feel something in the air, a presence, like the lingering memory of something waiting to be remembered. Mary shifted beside him. Well, do we just start whispering random things at it? Pippin snorted. Might as well try. Maybe it just needs to hear something old. He cleared his throat dramatically and leaned close to the stone. Once upon a time, there were 3 hobbits who... A low rumble beneath their feet made them all freeze. Pippin yelped and scrambled backward. I was joking. But Frodo wasn't laughing. His heart pounded. No, you might be onto something. Mary's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Frodo turned back to the door, thinking, what if it's not a specific phrase, but rather a voice? The voice of something old, something that belongs to the past? He paused. A song. Or a story. Pippin and Merry exchanged glances. The Shire had no shortage of old songs, but which one? Then Frodo knew. Taking a steadying breath, he began to recite, his voice low, the words trembling slightly as they left his lips. Far beyond the hills so deep, where shadow falls and rivers weep. It was a song Bilbo had sung to him as a child, a tale of a long-lost king who had vanished beneath the earth, waiting for a time when the world would need him once more. As Frodo's voice filled the air, the runes on the door glowed. The 3 hobbits stepped back as the ground trembled again, this time stronger. Dust fell from the roots tangled around the stone, and the sound of grinding rock filled the clearing. Then, with a deafening crack, the stone door split open. A gust of stale, cold air rushed past them, carrying the scent of earth long undisturbed. The darkness beyond the entrance was absolute, stretching into an abyss unseen. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Pippin broke the silence. I'm starting to think this wasn't a good idea. Merry gave him a dry look. Now you think that? Frodo, however, was staring into the passage, his heart hammering in his chest. Something wanted to be found. He could feel it. We've come this far, he murmured. We have to see what's inside. Pippin groaned. You always say that. But neither of them stopped him when he stepped forward. The air inside the tunnel was thick with dust and age. Their lanterns barely cut through the darkness, casting flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to hum with something old, something watching. Merry ran his fingers along the walls, his voice hushed. This isn't like any tunnel I've seen before. Frodo nodded. The stonework was ancient, carved with symbols that didn't belong to Hobbit history. These were not the gentle curves of burrowed homes, but the sharp, deliberate marks of something older. Pippin swallowed hard. I don't like this place. Neither did Frodo. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost to darkness. Their lanterns revealed something staggering, a throne. It stood at the center of the room, raised upon a stone dais. Dust and time had worn away much of its detail, but the shape remained unmistakable, a seat meant for a king. And in that throne sat a figure. Pippin's breath hitched. Oh, no! The figure was skeletal, draped in tattered remnants of what might have once been royal robes. A rusted crown rested on its brow, and in its bony grasp lay a sword, long and blackened with age. Frodo felt his throat tighten. The forgotten king. Merry stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. He was real. The realization settled over them like a weight. This was no legend. Some king, had been buried beneath the Shire, entombed in a place no hobbit had ever known. But why? Frodo moved forward, his heart thundering. He could feel something pulsing in the air, something beyond the realm of the living. His gaze drifted to the map in his hand, then back to the king's throne. This was what the map had led them to. But what was it warning them about? Pippin suddenly grabbed Frodo's sleeve. I don't think we should be here. Frodo turned to reassure him. And then the ground shifted. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the chamber, as if the very bones of the earth were stirring. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The lantern flames flickered wildly. Then the air grew heavy, too heavy. The skeleton on the throne moved. A hollow breath filled the cavern, and a voice, cold, ancient, and unreadable, whispered through the darkness. Who disturbs my slumber? Frodo went still. Merry grabbed his arm. Frodo. The lanterns flickered out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Darkness consumed them. Frodo's breath came in quick, sharp gasps as the last flicker of their lanterns died, leaving them in an abyss of cold and silence. The weight of the air pressed against his chest, and that voice still echoed in his mind. Who disturbs my slumber? His skin prickled. The chamber around them was no longer just an empty ruin. It was awake. Pippin let out a choked sound, barely more than a whisper. Frodo. I know, Frodo whispered back, his voice barely carrying in the suffocating blackness. Then, movement. A slow, deliberate shift of bone against stone. A sound that did not belong in a tomb long forgotten. A chill crept down Frodo's spine. His fingers clenched around the map, the parchment crinkling in his grip. They had stumbled upon something that should have remained undisturbed. Something that should have never been found. Then came a sound worse than the first. A slow, rattling inhale. The voice returned, stronger this time, as if speaking from a place beyond life itself. You bear the map of the betrayer. Frodo's heart slammed against his ribs. The betrayer? Beside him, Merry fumbled with the lantern, his hand shaking as he tried to relight it. Sparks flared in the darkness, casting brief glimpses of the throne and the thing that sat upon it. The skeletal figure no longer rested in stillness. The bony fingers had tightened around the hilt of its rusted sword. The empty sockets beneath the cracked crown now watched them. Merry finally managed to spark the lantern back to life, the dim flame flickering uncertainly, but it was enough. The three hobbits froze. The king's head had turned toward them. Pippin let out a whimper. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. Merry's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. Don't move. But it was too late. The skeletal king rose. Dust cascaded from its decayed robes, the sound like the shifting of centuries. It moved unnaturally, jerky, stiff, as if the weight of time still clung to its bones. Then it stepped forward. A deafening boom shook the cavern as its foot met the ground, sending vibrations through the floor. Dust rained down from above. The stale air grew colder, thick with something unseen. Frodo felt every muscle in his body scream at him to run. But he couldn't. The king raised its head, the rusted crown glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. The voice came again, hollow and deep, filled with something beyond rage, beyond sorrow. The heir of the thief comes at last. Frodo's throat went dry. What does that mean? Merry finally found his voice. What are you talking about? The king tilted its head, a slow and unnatural movement. You do not know what you carry? Frodo instinctively glanced at the map in his hands. The parchment seemed heavier now, pulsing with something he couldn't explain. Pippin, still gripping Frodo's arm in sheer terror, whispered, "Tell him we're just hobbits." Just hobbits. No heirs of thieves here. But Frodo knew it wouldn't be that simple. The king's grip tightened on its sword. The metal groaned in protest, weakened by centuries of decay, but still sharp enough to kill. You come seeking what was buried. The sins of the past will rise again. A low rumbling filled the chamber. The ground beneath them shuddered. Something else was waking. Frodo's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just a forgotten tomb. It was a prison, and they had just opened it. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the darkness beyond the throne. A sound that did not belong to the skeletal king. A sound far worse. Frodo's breath hitched. Pippin whimpered. Tell me that was just the wind. But Merry was already pulling at Frodo's sleeve. We need to go. Now. Frodo's mind raced. The door. They had to get back to the door. But the king took another step forward, blocking their way. No one leaves. The words slithered through the air like a curse. Merry cursed under his breath. We are not dying in some ancient tomb under the Shire. Frodo clenched his jaw. They couldn't fight this. The king was dead and still moving. What chance did hobbits stand against something that death itself had failed to silence? Then an idea struck him. A desperate, reckless idea. The map. The king had reacted to the map. Frodo gritted his teeth and held it up. You think we're here to steal from you? He said, forcing his voice to remain steady. We don't even know what this map is. But if you want it, he swallowed. Take it. The king stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, silence filled the cavern. Then, slowly, its bony hand lifted. Frodo's stomach twisted as the skeletal fingers curled toward him, reaching, waiting. Merry sucked in a breath. Frodo, what are you doing? Frodo hesitated. Something inside him screamed not to let go of the map. Some deep, buried instinct told him that this was wrong. But the king was no longer moving toward them. If this was the only way out. Then Pippin screamed. Not in fear. Not in panic. In pain. Frodo whipped around just in time to see Pippin drag backward into the dark. Something was in the shadows behind them, something large. The growl from before returned, but this time it was closer. Hungry. Merry lunged for Pippin, grabbing his arm just as something in the darkness pulled. For a brief, horrible moment, Frodo saw a shape, massive, hulking, eyes like burning coals. Not a wraith. Not a ghost. A beast. Something long buried. Something meant to stay forgotten. Pippin's fingers slipped. His scream vanished into the dark. Frodo acted without thinking. He grabbed the map and tore it from the king's reach, ripping the parchment in two. The air split. A sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once filled the chamber. The runes on the walls blazed to life. The ground heaved as if the very earth was breaking apart. And then, the beast roared. Frodo barely had time to scream before the world collapsed. The ground split open, swallowing the chamber in a violent tremor. Frodo barely had time to brace himself before the floor beneath them collapsed, sending him and Merry sprawling onto the cold stone. A deafening roar filled the cavern, shaking the walls as if the mountain itself had awakened. And Pippin was gone. Frodo's ears rang from the explosion of sound. His heart pounded as he struggled to sit up, his hands scraping against loose rubble. He blinked through the thick cloud of dust, searching desperately through the swirling darkness. Pippin. Merry's scream barely carried over the chaos. He stumbled forward, reaching out toward the void where their friend had been only moments before. His hands grasped at empty air. The chasm had swallowed him whole. Frodo's breath caught in his throat. "Pippin," he shouted, his voice raw. There was no answer, only the deep, guttural rumbling from below. Then came a new sound. A slow, grinding movement of something ancient and immense shifting beneath the ruins. Frodo felt it in his bones. A presence, not just the skeletal king before them, but something far older. Something that should have remained buried. The skeletal king stood unmoving, his rusted sword still clutched in bony fingers. His hollow gaze turned toward Frodo, the dim glow of the runes reflecting off his empty sockets. His voice echoed through the cavern, though his jaw never moved. "The seal is broken." A rush of cold air swirled through the chamber, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse, something unnatural. Frodo's fingers tightened into fists. "Where is Pippin?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. The king did not answer. Instead, his empty stare turned toward the darkness below. Merry dropped to his knees at the edge of the chasm, peering down. "I can't see anything," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's just empty." A deep, echoing growl rose from the abyss. Not a growl of a wraith, nor the whisper of a shadow. This was something alive. Frodo's stomach clenched. He turned to the king. "What did we wake up?" For a long moment, there was silence. Then, at last, the king spoke. "The Nameless One stirs." Frodo's breath hitched. The Nameless One? That name alone was enough to chill him to the core. Merry turned to him, his face pale. "We have to go after Pippin." Frodo nodded. There was no question. No hesitation. "We're not leaving him down there." "But how?" The chasm was deep, the darkness below seemingly endless. The only way down was to jump, a foolish, impossible act. And yet, something in Frodo's hands tingled. He looked down and realized he was still gripping the torn map. Its edges were frayed, the ancient ink now faintly glowing. The parchment pulsed, almost alive. Merry saw it too. "What is that?" Frodo swallowed hard. "I don't know." The skeletal king stepped forward. His presence loomed over them, his gaze locked onto the map. The path has been revealed. Frodo frowned. What path? Then, the runes on the walls shifted. A new glow spread across the cavern, illuminating something they hadn't seen before, a hidden stairway carved into the side of the chasm, spiraling downward into the depths. Merry's breath caught. That wasn't there before. Frodo's pulse quickened. The map had revealed it. Somehow, someway, the old parchment still held secrets. The skeletal king raised his sword, pointing toward the path. The way is open. But once you enter, there is no turning back. Frodo exchanged a glance with Merry. Fear burned behind his friend's eyes, but beneath it, determination. We don't leave Pippin behind, Merry said. Frodo nodded. And then they ran. The stone steps crumbled beneath their hurried descent. The walls around them were slick with age, covered in thick, tangled roots that had long since overtaken the ruins above. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. The sound of the beasts breathing echoed through the tunnels. It was close. Frodo's hand clenched around the broken map. Every few steps, the ink would shift, revealing twisting, moving shapes that pulsed in time with the darkness. The path ahead was changing, warping as if the tunnel itself was alive. Frodo, Merry gasped, "Are you sure this is the way?" Frodo wasn't sure of anything. But the map hadn't failed them yet. A sudden roar split the tunnel. The force of it shook the walls, knocking them off balance. Frodo caught himself against the stone just as Merry let out a cry. He turned in time to see his friend slip, his foot catching on loose rubble. "Merry!" He lunged, grabbing Merry's arm just in time to stop him from falling into another chasm. Merry's breath was ragged. "This place is falling apart." Frodo pulled him up, his pulse pounding. "We have to keep moving." And then they heard it. A voice. Faint. Weak. "Frodo?" Both hobbits froze. "Pippin." Frodo's heart nearly stopped. "Pippin." No response. Merry grabbed Frodo's sleeve. That didn't sound right. Frodo's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Merry meant. The voice had sounded like Pippin, but it was off. Too distant. Too hollow. Like an echo. Frodo swallowed hard. "We have to find him." Merry nodded, his grip tightening around his dagger. They pressed forward, the tunnel narrowing around them. The air was thicker now, suffocating, as if something unseen was watching. Then, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. And there, at the center, was Pippin. He was on the ground, motionless, his cloak torn, his face pale. Frodo didn't think, he ran. "Pippin." Merry grabbed his arm. "Wait." Too late. The moment Frodo stepped into the chamber, the ground shifted. The shadows moved. And then it emerged. From the far end of the cavern, rising from the abyss, came a shape of pure darkness. Not a wraith, nor a mere creature of flesh. It was something worse. Eyes like burning coals stared at them from the black mass. A mouth, lined with jagged, uneven fangs, curled into an unnatural grin. The nameless one had awakened. Frodo's breath caught in his throat. Pippin's voice, weak and broken, barely escaped his lips. "Run!" The beast lunged. Frodo barely had time to react before the darkness lunged toward them. A massive, shifting form, like a living void, unfurled from the depths, its presence crushing against the very air around them. It had no true shape, just writhing shadows and gleaming, ember-like eyes that burned with something ancient and hungry. Pippin was still on the ground, his body limp, barely moving. "Pippin!" Frodo sprinted forward, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Merry tried to grab him, but Frodo was too fast. He dashed across the uneven stone, dodging as a wave of darkness slammed into the ground beside him. A tremor rattled through the cavern, sending cracks through the stone. The sheer force of it nearly knocked him off his feet. The beast growled, a low, bone-shaking rumble that made every hair on Frodo's neck stand on end. Pippin stirred, his fingers twitching against the cold floor. His lips barely moved, but Frodo could hear it, a whisper. "Dee don't." Frodo skidded to his knees beside him. "Pip, I've got you." He reached down, grabbing Pippin's arm, but the moment he touched him, a shock of ice-cold energy surged through his body. Frodo gasped, his vision blurring for a second as a deep, guttural voice, not Pippin's, hissed into his mind. "Too late, little thief." A bolt of pure terror shot through him. He yanked Pippin away, ignoring the burning sensation that lingered in his hands. Merry's voice rang out behind him. "Frodo! Look out!" Frodo turned, just in time to see the shadows descending upon him. A massive, swirling tendril of pure darkness lashed forward. Frodo grabbed Pippin, rolling both of them out of the way as the force of the attack shattered the stone where they had been moments before. Debris flew, dust choked the air, and the cavern groaned like it was on the verge of collapse. Frodo coughed, struggling to keep his grip on Pippin, who still wasn't fully conscious. "Merry! We have to move." Merry was already in motion, his small dagger drawn, but what good it would do against something like this, Frodo didn't know. Then, the skeletal king spoke. "The Nameless One is awake. The mountain will not hold." Frodo turned sharply, his breath ragged. "What is it? How do we stop it?" The king's hollow gaze did not waver. "It cannot be stopped." The shadows shifted again, and the beast let out a sickening screech. The walls cracked, roots and rubble falling from above as the entire cavern trembled under the force of the ancient creature's rage. Frodo's grip on Pippin tightened. They had to escape. But the only way out was the way they came in. And the beast was between them and the exit. Pippin stirred against him, letting out a weak, pained sound. His eyes opened, just a sliver, but his expression was one of pure terror. "Frodo," he whispered. "It's in my head." Frodo's blood ran cold. The beast moved again, surging forward with terrifying speed. Shadows lashed out in all directions, forcing Merry to dodge and Frodo to dive away with Pippin in his arms. A jagged column of stone shattered beside them, nearly crushing them both. There was no time to think, only to run. But the creature wasn't letting them go. Frodo could feel it pressing into his mind, a cold, clawing sensation, searching, reaching for something. And then, in his hands, he felt it. The map. It was glowing again. Not just faintly, but with a bright, almost blinding light. The ink twisted and changed, forming symbols and markings he didn't recognize, shifting like something alive. And the beast hated it. The moment the light flared, the nameless one screamed. A horrible, ear-piercing wail filled the cavern, and the shadows around them recoiled, just slightly, but enough. Enough for Frodo to realize. The map was the key. Merry saw it too. Frodo, whatever that is, use it. Frodo's fingers tightened around the parchment. He had no idea how, but something deep inside him knew this was the only chance they had. He glanced at the skeletal king. How do we stop it? For the first time, the king's hollow gaze turned toward the map. The seal must be restored. Frodo swallowed hard. Ow! The cavern trembled again, and suddenly, the map burned. A searing heat spread through Frodo's hands, but he didn't drop it. The ink was shifting, forming something new, a shape, a pattern. And then, a gate. Not a real, physical gate, but a symbol etched onto the parchment in glowing runes. The beast must have sensed it, because it let out a horrific roar, its form twisting in fury. Frodo's mind raced. The map had led them here. The map had revealed the path down. And now, it was showing them a way to undo what they had unleashed. The seal, Frodo whispered. Merry, gripping his dagger, looked at him in desperation. What do we do? Frodo didn't hesitate. We close it. He grabbed Pippin tighter, pushing himself to his feet despite the shaking ground. He had one shot. The map burned brighter, and the air around them seemed to warp. The beast screeched, its shadows lunging toward Frodo in an act of pure desperation. And Frodo ran. Straight toward the heart of the chamber. Straight toward the seal. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it, power, old and terrible, pressing against him. But he didn't stop. He pressed the map against the stone where the markings had first been torn. The cavern exploded with light. A blinding, golden shockwave erupted from the map, surging hellward. The beast let out a horrifying scream, its form convulsing, shuddering as the shadows collapsed inward. The walls shook violently, cracks spiderwebbing across the ceiling. Frodo felt himself being yanked backward, as if an invisible force was pulling him away from the breaking reality around them. The last thing he saw, before the darkness swallowed everything, was the beast's ember-like eyes flickering. And then, silence. Frodo's consciousness drifted in and out, swallowed by a crushing darkness that felt endless. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still alive. His body felt weightless, floating in a vast abyss. He reached out, though he wasn't sure if it was physically or merely in his mind. The silence was suffocating, stretching around him like a void that had existed before time itself. Then, a voice, distant, faint, called to him. Frodo. He knew that voice. It was Merry. And another, weaker but still present. Frodo. Pippin. With a gasp, he jerked awake. The weight of reality crashed down on him all at once. His lungs ached as he sucked in a desperate breath. His limbs were sore, and his head pounded as though it had been struck by a hammer. The world around him was still rumbling, but something had changed. The chamber was collapsing. Thick cracks split through the stone walls, and great chunks of earth and rock were breaking free, crashing down into the abyss below. The air was thick with dust and the acrid stench of something burnt, something unnatural. And the creature. Frodo forced himself upright, his vision spinning. The nameless horror was still writhing, but it was no longer advancing. Its form had become unstable, its edges flickering like dying embers. It let out one final, echoing wail, a sound of unearthly agony, before its mass began to collapse inward. It was being pulled back, dragged into the rift of darkness from where it had been awakened. The seal had worked. Merry stumbled toward him, coughing from the dust. "Frodo! We have to go. The whole place is coming down." Frodo turned, his heart pounding. Pippin was still sprawled on the cold ground, his face pale and drenched in sweat. But his eyes were open now, flickering with weak recognition. Frodo reached for him. "Pip, can you move?" Pippin groaned, attempting to push himself up. "Feels like I got trampled by an oliphant." Merry snorted despite the situation, but his voice was tense. "I'll take that as a yes. Now let's go before we get buried alive." The ground beneath them lurched, nearly sending Frodo tumbling. He grabbed Pippin's arm, hauling him up as best he could, and together the three of them staggered toward the exit. Behind them, the monstrous shadows that had once filled the chamber were being swallowed into the abyss, disappearing into the rift as the light of the seal forced them away. But the force of the seal's power had destabilized everything. Massive stalactites broke free from the ceiling, slamming into the ground with earth-shaking force. The stone bridge they had used to cross was already beginning to crumble, its edges cracking apart. "Faster!" Merry shouted. Frodo pushed himself forward, Pippin half leaning against him for support. The three of them sprinted, their feet barely touching the ground before another tremor nearly knocked them off balance. The entrance tunnel was just ahead, but the walls were caving in. Frodo's breath caught in his throat. They weren't going to make it. The tunnel mouth collapsed inward, a cascade of stone and rubble sealing off their escape route. "No!" Merry skidded to a stop, panic flashing across his face. Frodo turned wildly, searching for another way out. But there was nothing, only a solid wall of rock where their exit had once been. The cavern was collapsing, and in mere moments they'd be buried along with whatever remained of the beast. Then, a flicker of golden light. Frodo's gaze snapped downward. The map. It was still clenched tightly in his fingers, its surface glowing faintly, the runes shifting and pulsing as if guiding him. "Frodo, what are you?" But Frodo didn't hesitate. He pressed the map against the wall of rubble, his mind barely registering the searing heat that pulsed from it. The golden lens flared. And then, with a deafening crack, the stone split open. Not fully, but enough. A narrow gap, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, appeared in the rock. The golden light from the map dimmed, but the path it had carved remained. Frodo turned to the others, his voice hoarse. "Go! Now!" Merry didn't need to be told twice. He ducked through the opening first, scrambling forward. Frodo shoved Pippin next, practically pushing him through before diving in after him. The moment they emerged on the other side, the cavern behind them collapsed completely, a deafening roar of stone sealing away whatever remained of the nameless horror forever. The three hobbits tumbled onto damp earth, gasping for breath. The cold, fresh air of the Shire hit them like a wave. They were outside. Alive. Frodo turned over, coughing from the dust still clinging to his lungs. The night sky stretched above them, full of stars, and the air smelled of grass and rain. The old, forgotten passage they had entered through had been sealed shut by the collapse. There was no sign of the horror beneath the ground. No trace of the monster. No sign that anything had ever happened. Only the map remained, its glow now gone, its once shifting runes frozen in place. Pippin groaned, rubbing his aching forehead. I am never going near another cave again. Mary let out a breathless, shaky laugh. Agreed. Frodo barely heard them. His fingers traced the edges of the map, his mind still spinning with everything that had happened. Bilbo had always said that adventures had a way of finding you, and he had never quite understood what that meant. Until now. Pippin rolled over onto his back, staring up at the sky. You know, he murmured, his voice unusually quiet, I can still hear it, in my head. Frodo and Merry turned toward him sharply. Pippin gave a small, uneasy smile. Not speaking, not words. Just a whisper. Like something far away. Mary's expression darkened. Pip. I know, Pippin said quickly, waving a hand. It's probably nothing. I'm just tired. Frodo exchanged a glance with Merry, unease settling in his chest. Maybe Pippin was right. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, Frodo couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Shire was safe. For now. But there were things beneath the earth, things that had slumbered for centuries, things that were never meant to wake. And as Frodo sat there, staring at the now silent map in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder. Had they truly sealed the horror forever? Or had they merely given it time to wait and watch? And so, the story comes to an end, but its whispers remain, drifting through the night air and the rolling hills of the Shire. They made it back, carrying a map that no longer glowed. But the question lingers, has the darkness truly returned to its slumber, or is it simply waiting for the right moment to rise again? Let that thought fade as sleep gently calls to you. Take a deep breath, feel the weight of the night settling in. The world around you grows softer, like a candle flickering out, leaving only the quiet embrace of the evening. Now, close your eyes, and let sleep take you away. Rest well, and dream deeply.